On March 12, 1945, just after dawn, the frost still clung to the barbed wire outside a prisoner of war camp in central Germany. The war was nearing its end, though no one standing there could feel it. The guards were tense, the prisoners thin and silent, and the nearby village remained half asleep under a sky the color of dull steel. At the edge of the camp fence stood a German teenager, no older than 17. His hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn coat. He had come alone before the day officially began, when routines were looser and eyes less focused. Inside his pocket were several small pieces of chocolate dark, uneven, rationed carefully over weeks. Chocolate had become a luxury so rare that it was almost symbolic, something associated with memory rather than taste. He had not planned a speech. He had not planned resistance. He had planned only this moment. The prisoners noticed him before the guards did. Hollow faces turned slightly. Eyes followed his movements. He did not speak. He simply waited for the moment when proximity became possible. Then, with a quick motion, he slipped the chocolate through the wire, letting it fall into waiting hands. For a second, nothing happened. The world seemed to pause, as if unsure how to respond to something so small. Then a shout cut through the cold air. Boots moved fast. Orders followed, sharp and unmistakable. The teenager did not run. He did not argue. He stood still as he was pulled away from the fence. The prisoners were driven back. The chocolate was crushed under a boot, smeared into the dirt where no one could retrieve it. The boy's face showed fear now, but not confusion. He understood what he had done. He understood the rules. In a system built on obedience, kindness had become a violation. As he was marched away, the camp returned to silence. The prisoners looked at the ground where the chocolate had fallen, not because it was lost, but because it had existed at all. For a brief moment, someone had seen them as human. That moment would be used against him. The teenager came from the nearby village, a place that had grown quieter as the war dragged on. Many of the older men were gone, some to the front, others to graves without markers. Food was scarce, fear was common, rules were everywhere. He had grown up inside this system, taught what to say, how to stand, when to look away. By 17, he knew the consequences of disobedience as well as any adult. He also knew hunger. He knew what rationing meant, how families stretched meals, how children learned not to ask for more. The chocolate he carried had not been easy to obtain. It had been saved deliberately, hidden carefully, not for himself, but for people he was told were enemies. The prisoners were Allied soldiers, captured months earlier, marched across borders, stripped of names and reduced to numbers. They were visible from the road, thin figures moving in controlled patterns, watched constantly. Villagers were warned not to interact. Helping prisoners was labeled treason. Even looking too long could draw suspicion. The teenager had looked anyway. He had seen how the prisoners walked, how they carried themselves with what strength remained. He had seen their hands shake in the cold. He did not know their stories, their languages, or their names. He did not need to. Hunger did not require translation. There was no organized plan behind his action, no group, no ideology. It was not an act of rebellion in the way resistance is often remembered. It was an individual decision made quietly, without expectation of reward or recognition. That was what made it dangerous. When he was arrested, the process moved quickly. There was no long investigation, no need for proof beyond what had been witnessed. The charge was clear: aiding the enemy. In the final months of the war, punishment was not softened by proximity to defeat. In so many places, it was intensified. He was questioned briefly, asked why he had done it. Accounts suggest he did not deny his action. He did not frame it as political. He did not speak of loyalty or betrayal. He spoke simply, explaining that the prisoners were hungry. That explanation did not help him. The system he stood before was not designed to weigh compassion. It was designed to enforce order through fear. His age offered no protection. His lack of intent offered no mitigation. What mattered was the example his punishment would set. As he waited in custody, the village continued its routines. Peopli worked children, walked to school, the camp remained in place. Life did not stop to acknowledge what was coming. This, too, was part of the structure violence delivered quietly, without disruption. The teenager understood, by then, that the chocolate had ceased to matter as food. It had become evidence, a symbol of a boundary crossed. He had not crossed it by accident. He had crossed it because, for one moment, he chose to see prisoners not as enemies, but as Popli. That choice would define the rest of his life, which was now measured not in years, but in days. In the days that followed, the teenager was held in a small cell, its walls bare and unmarked. There was no ceremony to his confinement, no dramatic announcement, just a door closing, a lock turning, and time slowing into something heavy and difficult to measure. Outside, the war pressed forward. Inside, he waited. He was given little information. He was not told when a decision would be made or what form it would take. Yet he did not expect release. The rules were clear, even if they were not always written down. Helping prisoners was forbidden. Punishment was absolute. Uncertainty lay only in the method, not the outcome. At first, fear dominated everything. His thoughts returned repeatedly to the moment at the fence, the feel of the chocolate in his hand, the quick movement, the sound of the shout. He replayed it without regret, but with an awareness of how small actions could carry enormous weight. He realized that the choice itself had been simple. Living with it was harder. As hours turned into days, something shifted. The fear did not disappear, but it changed shape. It became quieter, more contained. In its place came a clarity he had not known before. He understood that he was no longer participating in the world as expected of him. He had stepped outside it, and there would be no return. When he was finally brought before authorities, the setting was plain. No crowd, no public display. The charge was read. The incident described in precise, impersonal language. The word chocolate appeared in the record as an object stripped of context, emotion, and meaning. It was listed as contraband assistance to enemy forces. He was asked again why he had done it. Witnesses later recalled that his answer did not change. He did not accuse anyone else. He did not ask for mercy. He did not claim confusion. He stated calmly that the prisoners were starving and that he believed helping them was right. There was no response to that statement. It did not fit within the framework of the proceeding. Right and wrong were not under consideration. Obedience and violation were. As the sentence was delivered, the teenager listened without interruption. He showed no visible resistance. The finality of the words did not surprise him. He had already understood where the path led. What surprised him was not the severity of the punishment, but the emptiness surrounding it. No anger, no outrage, just procedure. In the hours before his execution, there were no speeches, no letters preserved for history. He was allowed to sit quietly. Accounts suggest he asked for nothing beyond basic dignity. Those who encountered him noted his composure, not as defiance, but as acceptance. This was the transformation war imposed on the young, not through ideology alone, but through compression forcing decisions, consequences, and endings into spaces too small to contain them. He had entered the war as a civilian shaped by rules. He would leave it as a warning encoded into silence. On the morning it was carried out, the sky showed no sign of significance. Weather did not mark the moment. History did not pause. The execution was efficient, intended to deter others from similar acts. It was not meant to be remembered. Yet memory does not always follow intention. The teenager's action, insignificant in material terms, had revealed a fault line in the system around him. It showed how fragile authority became when confronted by simple humanity. Chocolate, a substance associated with comfort in childhood, had become a catalyst for death. As the war moved toward its end, his name did not appear in major records. His story survived only in fragments, carried by those who witnessed it and understood what it meant. He had not altered the course of the war. He had altered something smaller and perhaps more enduring, the reminder that even under total control, moral choice remained possible. That realization did not save him, but it reshaped how his story would be understood long after the gunfire faded and the camps were emptied, preparing the ground for questions history would later be forced to ask. As the date of the sentence approached, the logic behind it became clearer, even if it remained unbearable. The teenager was not being punished because chocolate had reached prisoners. He was being punished because the act challenged something larger than rules. It suggested that compassion could exist where obedience was demanded. That idea, more than any material assistance, was considered dangerous. By March 1945, the German state was unraveling. Cities were in ruins, supply lines were broken. Defeat was no longer theoretical, yet authorities still clung to structure through fear. In this environment, mercy was treated as a form of sabotage. Every public punishment served a purpose, to remind others that control remained intact, even as reality contradicted it. The impossible idea, in this case, was simple and therefore intolerable that a civilian, especially a young one, could recognize shared humanity across imposed enemy lines and act on it. No weapons were involved, no plans disrupted, yet the symbolism was profound. If one teenager could decide that hunger outweighed orders, others might decide the same. Systems built on absolute compliance could not allow that possibility. Those responsible for enforcing the sentence understood its message. It was meant to be seen, discussed quietly, internalized. The teenager became a vehicle for deterrence, stripped of individuality and official language. His age was not emphasized. His motive was not examined. What mattered was the outcome. In custody, he began to grasp this reality fully. His fate was no longer personal. It had been repurposed. He was no longer a person who had acted, but an example others were expected to learn from. This understanding did not produce panic. It produced a restrained calm, the kind that follows when options disappear. He thought again of the prisoners at the fence. He did not know if any of them had managed to retrieve the chocolate before it was destroyed. He did not know if they would ever learn what had happened to him. The imbalance of that knowledge struck him quietly. He would know everything about their hunger. They would know nothing of his ending. That imbalance did not feel unjust to him. It felt consistent with the world as it had become. In the days leading up to the execution, he was not isolated completely. Guards spoke to him briefly, without warmth or cruelty. Procedure continued. Meals were provided. Time moved forward. The ordinary nature of these routines made the situation feel unreal, as if life itself had not yet acknowledged what was coming. The teenager did not attempt to retract his statement. He did not search for language that might reframe his action. There was no appeal rooted in loyalty or fear. When asked again about his motive, he repeated it unchanged. The prisoners were hungry. That was all. This repetition, simple and unyielding, became its own form of resistance. Not loud, not organized, but immovable. It refused the complexity this system wanted to impose. It reduced the situation to its moral core and left nothing else to debate. As the final night approached, the impossible idea took its clearest shape. Not that his action would change the outcome, but that it had already escaped control. The chocolate was gone. His life would soon be gone. Yet the meaning of what he had done could no longer be erased. It existed independently now, carried by witnesses, embedded in memory. That was the threat. Not disruption, but persistence. He slept little. When he did, dreams were fragmented and ordinary as village. Familiar streets, a table with food he could no longer taste. There were no visions of heroism, only unfinished moments. When morning came, it arrived without ceremony, carrying him forward into the final stage of a decision made long before. The execution was scheduled early, before the day could gather attention. There was no crowd, no announcement posted publicly. Those present understood their roles. The process unfolded with mechanical precision, designed to minimize disruption rather than suffering. Efficiency was mistaken for order. The teenager was brought out under guard. He was dressed plainly. His hands were not shaking. Observers later noted his composure, not as bravery, but as resignation shaped by clarity. He knew what was happening. He did not resist. Resistance would have changed nothing. The location was chosen for practicality. There was no symbolic backdrop, no need for spectacle. The message had already been delivered through rumor and quiet confirmation. The act itself was merely completion. As the final steps were taken, there were no last words recorded for history, no statements prepared. The teenager did not attempt to justify himself further. His earlier explanation had been sufficient. Repeating it again would have added nothing. Silence, at this point, carried more weight. Those tasked with carrying out the sentence followed orders. They did not debate. They did not pause longer than required. Systems like the one in place depended on repetition, not reflection. Each completed action reinforced the expectation that the next would be carried out the same way. When it was over, there was no immediate reaction, no applause, no acknowledgement beyond documentation. The body was removed. The space was cleared. The day resumed its course. Elsewhere, the war continued collapsing inward. Front lines shifted. Camps were abandoned. Prisoners were moved or left behind. News traveled unevenly. Some learned of the execution quickly. Others never did. Among the Allied prisoners, there was no record that they were told. The system that punished compassion did not consider closure necessary. The significance of the execution lay not in its visibility, but in its contradiction. It occurred at a moment when the authority enforcing it was already losing control. The severity of the punishment exposed insecurity rather than strength. It revealed a system more afraid of moral fracture than military defeat. In the village, people spoke quietly, not in public. Not Ingrid's names were not mentioned openly. Fear remained effective, even as belief weakened. That was how control lingered through habit, not conviction. The teenager's action did not stop the war. It did not save lives in measurable numbers, yet its execution marked a boundary. It demonstrated how far a system would go to defend obedience, even when its foundations were already failing. For those who later learned of the event, the shock came not from the existence of punishment, but from its disproportion. Chocolate, reduced to an object in a report, had been weighed against authority and found intolerable. A human life had been the balancing cost. That imbalance would remain unresolved. No document would justify it convincingly. No later explanation would make it necessary. As the war ended and records were examined, the execution stood as evidence of how violence persists, even when its purpose has vanished. And in that persistence, the teenager's final act, simple, unarmed, uncelebrated, continued to speak long after the system that condemned it ceased to exist. When the war ended weeks later, events like the teenager's execution were not addressed immediately. The scale of destruction was vast. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. Camps were opened, revealing crimes that demanded urgent attention. In this landscape of overwhelming loss, smaller stories were easily buried, yet records endure in fragments. Court documents, witness recollections, village memories pass quietly from one generation to the next. Through these fragments, the outline of the teenager's story survived, not because it altered military outcomes, but because it exposed something essential about how power behaves when it senses its own collapse. Historically, the late months of the war were marked by intensified internal punishment. Acts that might once have resulted in imprisonment increasingly ended in execution. The purpose was no longer strategic. It was psychological. Authority sought to preserve itself by demonstrating that mercy would not be tolerated, even when defeat was imminent. The teenager's case fits this pattern precisely. His action posed no tactical threat. It did not arm prisoners or enable escape. It challenged only one thing: the idea that obedience must override moral judgment. That challenge, though quiet, struck at the core of enforced conformity. In post-war analysis, Such cases are often referenced to illustrate how systems of control criminalize compassion. The teenager's age underscores this point. He was not a political leader, an organizer, or a trained dissident. He was a minor acting alone, guided by empathy rather than ideology. His punishment reveals how indiscriminate repression had become. Importantly, his story also complicates simplified narratives of wartime populations. It resists the notion that civilians can be neatly categorized as supporters or opponents. Human behavior under extreme pressure is inconsistent, shaped by circumstance, fear, and fleeting opportunities to choose differently. The Allied prisoners he tried to help remain anonymous in historical records. Their survival or death cannot be traced to that moment. Yet the meaning of his action does not depend on outcome. It depends on intent and on the system's response to that intent. As historians later examined such cases, they became reference points not because they were typical, but because they were revealing. They showed how moral agency persisted even when punished, and how punishment itself became a sign of institutional failure rather than strength. The teenager did not live to see these interpretations, but through them, his final choice became part of a broader understanding of the war's human cost when measured not only in numbers, but in the silencing of compassion where it appeared. The teenager's name is still not widely known. There are no monuments marking the place where he died. His story survives not through official commemoration, but through This absence is not accidental. Histories built around power rarely preserve the identities of those punished for empathy. Yet the legacy of his action continues to surface wherever the limits of obedience are questioned. His story is taught quietly in ethical discussions, referenced in examinations of wartime justice, and remembered by families who lived near the camp and understood what his choice had cost. What gives the story its endurance is not martyrdom, but scale. The act itself was small. Chocolate passed through wire. No speech, no demand, no expectation of recognition. In that smallness lies its force. It reminds us that moral decisions are often made without witnesses, without certainty, and without time to weigh consequences fully. The teenager did not imagine himself as courageous. Available accounts suggest he saw his action as ordinary, even obvious. That perspective challenges later attempts to frame his death as exceptional. What was exceptional was not the impulse to help, but the environment that made such help punishable by death. For modern audiences, the story raises uncomfortable questions. How does a society reach a point where kindness is defined as treason? What conditions allow systems to treat empathy as a threat? And how many similar stories were erased because no record survived? The teenager's execution did not end cruelty. It did not restore order. It did not strengthen authority in any lasting way. The system that condemned him collapsed shortly afterward, discredited by its own excesses. What remained were the consequences borne by individuals whose lives ended before that collapse arrived. In remembering him, it is important not to romanticize suffering or to assign meaning where none was intended. He did not choose death. He chose to help. The meaning was imposed afterward by those who needed to explain why such help had been intolerable. His legacy, then, is not one of sacrifice demanded by history, but of humanity asserted despite history. It exists as a quiet counterpoint to narratives of inevitability, reminding us that even in the most controlled environments, choice persists. That persistence does not guarantee survival, but it does ensure that history, when examined closely, cannot fully erase the moments when individuals refused to surrender their moral judgment, even when the cost was everything. Questions for the audience. Was the teenager's choice an act of resistance or simply an act of humanity? How should history remember those punished for compassion rather than violence? What responsibility do individuals carry when laws demand the rejection of empathy? This is the history of World War II. Whoever oppresses the innocent is an oppressor. Neither of the earth belongs to this oppressor, nor does the sky belong to him. We stand, now and forever, with the oppressed. This is WW2 Files. See you in the next one.